The ways in which we confront and deal with the absurd can represent an evolution of freedom, depending on various factors, like the directional trajectory of the projected path of the philosophical traveler, and whether or not this path is ultimately aimed at confronting or evading it. Like sometimes a non-religious person consciously chooses to join a religion, which would seem to represent the most deliberate concerted effort to partake in an evasion of the absurd. But this isn't the most usual case with the followers of religion, who are by and large mostly born into it. We should still understand from the get-go that blind faith in some higher power, investments into beliefs concerning some outside factor that supplies meaning, or higher callings, or divine missions, whether it be a god, a mystical deity, or any other kind of mythological entity, still technically represent evasions of the absurd, even though most of the time this isn't even a conscious choice of a person, as we are brought into the evasive mindset from a very early age, instructed as such in childhood, and instilled with belief systems long before we even reach the age of reason. So really, until we are able to break free from dogmatic thinking in the rigid confines of religion and theocracy, it can't even be said that we are confronting the absurd, as we have not yet even become aware that such a philosophical conflict exists. With this in mind, some may think that perhaps it would be better to avoid the conflict altogether, but passing through this step is a rite of passage in philosophy, and to avoid it is to avoid maturation, which means a lack of growth in wisdom, intellect, and a diminished capacity both mentally and spiritually. So, necessarily, unless one is determined to keep their head in the sand, the death of the extrinsic God and the reconsideration of the universe from a new positional mindset are prerequisites of consciousness-based progression. Now, why does the death of God lead to the absurd? Well, with the absence of God, wherein does meaning, purpose, clarity, and significance come from? If these features are not aspects that are provided to man by outside deities that assign them, then, shockingly enough, they must be intrinsic in nature. So then what does this mean? The so-called universe is objectively meaningless. And so this is where absurdity sets in. And often, extreme anxiety usually follows. This discontented state evokes a haggard, harried, desperate apprehensiveness, which is marked by an insidious sense of dread, cosmic horror, revulsion, and just a general state of disgusted dissatisfaction that spreads throughout the core of one's being with an ever-growing feeling of impatience and anger. Left unfettered, this type of anxiety-fueled mode of operation leads to pessimism, cynicism, and then eventually outright misanthropy. Indeed, this is the state where misanthropy puts down its roots, and anything that is rooted is attached to a position. Now, some people who have rejected God and are broadsided by the meaninglessness have the opportunity to find other replacements to fill the void created by a lack of God. These are important steps away from absurdity. Absurdity, despite the masochistic victim appeal of its anguished disposition, is ultimately meant to serve as a catalyst, not as a wallowing ground. once one has got their fill of pain and suffering, the hope is that they will look to take their journey a bit further and a bit deeper, rather than just remain forever stagnant in the shallow layer of the taxing mundane reality. This can potentially bring our traveler a step closer to an important gateway, the beginnings of introspective inquiry. If one cannot find meaning outside of themselves in the universe, then they're going to have to either look within themselves to invent their own meaning, existentialism, or they're going to have to let go of the need to invent a meaning and be content with the extent of the internal as their sole companion, nihilism. Either way, the beginnings of internal reference has finally come to the forefront. These are not exactly the most optimum positions one should hope to reach, but they are certainly a step closer than theism, atheism, or absurdism. Existentialism shows our traveler that significant factors can be derived introspectively, while nihilism removes outside distractions and falsehoods, leaving the introspective more easily accessible. Now, some have dismissed existentialism as romantic nostalgia, or as a surrogate theology, but I wouldn't equate the evasions of religion to include existentialism in the same way, as religion and superstition avoid confronting the absurd, while existentialism is more of a product of the result of the confrontation. Religion asks you to accept aspects as true and real that fall outside of personal experience, while existentialism taps into what's most true and real, the aspects of personal experience. Naturally, to become overly extended into existentialism to the point where a fantasy superimposes itself onto illusion would be taking it in the wrong direction, and would eventually constitute yet even more externalization conditioning. And this could crop up as a possible sidetrack down a slippery slope. But the hope is that the relationship with the existential would eventually enable a more internal frame of reference, which could potentially lead towards facilitating a freshly cleaned projection lens and open the elusive doorway towards true self-recognition. If we have learned anything from God's obituary, it's that the fundamental truth of reality is not anywhere to be found extrinsically. And what is it that even provides the context for the question of the fundamental truth of reality to be asked? Until one reaches the point where one discovers for themselves that the source of attention is the foundation of a reality, then one will be continually lost in various phantom worlds of one type or another, with little to no ability to navigate it with a directed purpose. To be able to navigate a reality with a directed purpose is an exercise of first-hand power, facilitated by the employment of will and intent, which are metaphysical tools one is able to manipulate with increased lucidity. The investigation and exploration of lucidity is of key importance, because increased lucidity uncovers a truth that has been covered over by years of externalization conditioning. That is, the acquired instilled belief that the origins and manifestations of reality are found outside of oneself in the field of perceived phenomena of perception. This conditioning is the linchpin to our entire disempowerment, the crux of our utter complete enslavement to a limited frame of reference. In order for one to be able to reach a point where one is able to redirect the focus onto the source of attention, a gradual unleashing of the mind must take place, which is a process of unlearning all the various restricting chains that hold the mind down into a locked position. This process will eventually lead one to the truth, but it won't be an easy road to travel for most that dare to walk it. One of the major challenges of this road is developing the ability for detachment. That is, the aptitude for letting go of our tight mental grip onto the concepts and objects of our perceived reality. Whoa, wait a minute. Tight mental grip on both concept and object? Don't you mean just concept, Sage? Are not concept and object two different things? Well, that's the thing. Besides the fact that neither one of these things, concept or object, are things proper, no, they are not separate or different at all. But how could that be? Well, one of the truths that you will eventually discover if you continually put forth effort into detachment, which are any activities that promote selflessness and the free-flowing fluidity of a non-grasping mode of being, which help to foster the focus of attention towards its source, rather than on projected content, is the interconnectivity of reality and the mind. Once we begin to catch on to the truth of this connection, we can really begin to see and experience for ourselves how reality is a production of the mind. And as such, it can be known that physicality is really just a denser mental state. Becoming intimate with this connection firsthand is what will enhance and reinforce one's knowing and utilization of its secrets.